The upcoming presidential election is going to be the most contentious of our lifetimes, without a doubt. And either way it goes, things are not going to be good. Now, I don't expect there to be violence in terms of riots and things like that if Kamala Harris wins. But if Kamala Harris wins, then we will just continue our nosedive into oblivion as a country. And so you're going to need to be prepared for that anyway. However, if Donald Trump wins, and I'm going to tell you just right off the bat, just lay all my cards on the table here, I hope that he does. I hope we don't have another 4 years of a Harris administration. Now, let's talk about what might be coming. Again, what I've realized is there's so much to this. If we're talking about what preparations we might need to make if things go sideways, there's so much to it that it's not going to be one live. It's going to have to be several. I want to say at the outset, for those of you who are supporters, once this is over, I will put up a document, a PDF document that has the outline of what I'm going to talk about. It's for you to read. And I made checklists and all sorts of things that you can probably find useful, because I don't want to just talk about the terrible things that might happen. I want to give you concrete things that you can do to make your family safer. So that's what I want to get into. Now, let me just start by saying I spend the majority of my time outside the United States. And being a war correspondent for the past 20 years, I've seen a lot of places where law and order has broken down. I've been to a lot of places where the logistics train isn't working and it's hard to get supplies. I've been to a lot of places that are extremely violent and where they have a generalized loss of civility. And so I've seen how people deal with these things, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this in the context of this upcoming election. Because like I say, if Donald Trump gets elected, it's going to get lit. It's on for not just a day or two. It's going to be on probably for all 4 years that he's in office. I was there on Inauguration Day in 2017 when Donald Trump took office the first time. I was in Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. And I was covering the riots that took place there in Washington, D.C. Now, D.C. is one of the most wealthy, heavily policed, highly secure areas in the world. And yet there were thousands of people marching through the streets, smashing windows, setting cars on fire, attacking people, stealing things, looting. It was insane. I myself got assaulted multiple times in my attempts to cover what they were doing. They were all wearing masks. They were all dressed alike, wearing black. And so they felt this sort of liberty to go about creating mayhem, destroying the work of other men's hands. And in so doing, they created a firestorm of mob rule and incivility. So I've been there. I've seen it, not just outside the United States, but inside the United States. I was there covering the riots in Portland. I was covering the riots in Seattle. I was covering Black Lives Matter protests. So I've seen how bad it can get. And believe me, it can get very bad. Outside the United States, in places like the war in Ukraine, obviously that's a generalized loss of civility in the war zone areas out by the front lines. The difference is the people out there are used to living with hardship. They're people that have grown up growing their own food, raising their own animals, taking care of themselves, not reliant on the government, not reliant on digital anything. They live a completely analog life. They live very much like their ancestors did 100, 200 years ago. And so they know how to get by. They know how to grow a garden. They have established orchards and farms and things like that. so that they can get by. People in the United States don't have that anymore. Those sorts of skills and that knowledge base is being lost at a rapid pace. 100 years ago, about 90% of Americans lived in rural areas, worked on farms, grew their own food, raised their own animals. Now, about 1% of America does that. And that 1% does so with the help of massive amounts of technology, artificial intelligence, industrial equipment, and that creates a very fragile infrastructure for survival in the case of a loss of civility. Many of you don't know, but I do some security consulting on the side to, for example, do security and logistics for very high net worth individuals when they want to travel overseas, or provide security for events, either in the United States or elsewhere. I've done contracts consulting with the State Department for programs that they have in Central America, and they have to keep their people safe. And my job was to go look at what their people were doing and help them find ways to keep from being robbed in the process of doing their jobs, and things like that. So I've got a lot of experience with being prepared and equipped to deal with loss of civility, security issues, and preparedness. And so I want to bring to you some of that expertise and try to give you some real solid advice on what you can do to be prepared, because I think if you're watching this live, you probably agree with me that things could be about to get very bad in the United States. So first of all, it would be remiss of me not to just at least mention that you should definitely vote, that voting has consequences. And when you sometimes find yourself in a situation where voting for the thing that you believe to be right might actually result in more chaos, you shouldn't let that be a reason not to vote for what's right. I'm going to vote for the candidate that I think will do the best long-term for America, even if I wish that there was a better option out there. I'm going to be a realist, and I'm going to vote for the candidate I think will do the best job for the economy, for global geopolitics, for America's standing in the world, and in the long run, what will be best for my children and grandchildren who live in the United States. All right, so with that as prelude, the fact that I've got more than 20 years of experience in non-permissive environments, and I've made a professional hobby out of consulting with people on how to be safer, especially in places that are prone to loss of civility. I think that I can bring something to the table here in terms of what kind of preparedness you should be thinking about. Now, we all know why this is crucial. I just want to talk very quickly about the illusion of stability in the United States. Many of you live in parts of the United States that are not inner city. You live out in the country, you live in a small town, and you say, well, things are still pretty normal out here. It's safe where I live. We don't lock our doors. Everybody's armed. We live in a conservative area. I hear that a lot. I live in New York, but I live in a conservative area of New York. And while that makes it marginally better for you, but if I've learned anything in the last 20 years, it's craziness can happen at the drop of a hat. There are 1,000 reasons out there that you can't plan for that could lead to a breakdown of society in your area we haven't even thought of yet. I believe as a man, it's my job to look ahead and to try to prepare and plan and try to think about what kinds of things could pose a risk to me and my family, and then prepare to counteract those risks. But in reality, I understand that at the end of the day, I can't plan for everything. There's far too many possibilities out there, and those possibilities could lead to big problems. And so I need to be prepared anyway. As one author put it, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and trust God for the rest. What I'm getting at is that if you haven't taken care of your spiritual preparedness, then you're behind the 8 ball already. That should be the first thing that you do. And thankfully, it's the least expensive and probably the most effective. If you are spiritually prepared for the future, you can handle whatever comes at you. Now, that doesn't mean that you should say, well, I trust God and that's good enough, because God gave you a brain for a reason. And if God hands you a shovel, you shouldn't stand there and just wish for a hole to appear. If God gives you a brain, you should make use of that brain to do the best you can to take care of your family. The Bible says that a man who won't provide for his own is worse than an unbeliever. So if you say, well, I'm a believer, that's good enough. I trust God. I got everything I need. The Bible literally addresses that sentiment directly and says, if you won't take what God gave you and use it to provide for your family, then you are worse than somebody who doesn't believe at all. So you can't rest on your laurels and say, well, since I'm spiritually prepared, I don't need anything else. You do. You should be going on beyond that. Now, the concept of normalcy bias, that is, you're saying, well, there's never been a mob of angry, hungry people rampaging through my neighborhood, so there probably never will. It's hard for us to imagine how bad it could get. That's called normalcy bias. And we need to do what we can to try to overcome normalcy bias by thinking about the possibilities, by thinking about what would the nightmare scenario be, and I'll prepare for that. And if I'm prepared for the nightmare scenario, then I'll probably be prepared for whatever else comes. So to give you an example of that, when we lived in the United States, had been preparing for a long time for zombie apocalypse, worst case scenario, terrible loss of civility, etc. And we lived out in the country in West Virginia, and we lived at the end of a dead-end road, and we had some pretty good preps in place. My wife and a lot of other people kind of thought I was a little crazy for always thinking about this stuff and for constantly stocking up on things and buying more guns and ammo and things like that. And then one day, a stiff wind blew through. They called it a microburst, I think. And it blew down a whole bunch of trees in our area, knocked out power to a whole bunch of houses in our area of West Virginia. I was traveling at the time. I was on my way home from a speaking engagement. My wife called and said, hey, the power went out. It looks like it might be out for a while because there's a lot of trees down. And what should we do? And I said, well, we're probably fine. Have one of our sons go out and get the generator fired up and make sure that it works. But you should probably strap on a pistol just in case, because I know that there are people around us who probably have not prepared very well. And if this goes on for more than a couple of days, they might get desperate and you might want to be able to defend yourself. So she did that and kind of thought I was a little crazy. I was getting on the plane and was getting ready to come home. So I got home within 24 hours of that conversation. But as it turns out, I was wrong. It didn't take people a couple of days or a week to get desperate. They were desperate in less than 24 hours, because when I got home, I stopped at a local gas station and there were all these people there at the gas station and they were pounding on the doors and screaming and yelling. And the guy inside the gas station was saying, I can't help you. I don't have any electricity. I can't process anybody's payments. And people were like, I've got a credit card. I've got to buy food. I don't have any food in my house. There's no formula for my baby. I need food. We're desperate. Help. But even if he wanted to take cash, people didn't have cash. They weren't prepared and didn't have even enough cash to buy a few groceries. And so they were desperate. And there were instances in our neighborhood of people having their doors kicked in. The local gun store where I often shop got almost immediately cleaned out. Somebody actually took a I don't know, a welding torch or something, and cut a hole through the steel door of the vault and cleaned them out and stole everything because they knew that their alarm system would be not functioning since there was no electricity. All of that happened within 24 hours of the power going out in our area. Now, our power came back on fairly quickly, but some people were out of power for a couple of weeks. Definitely was an eye-opener for us. And it made me look around and say, oh man, I strongly believe now that churches should be the answer to a failure of civility or a generalized grid down scenario or any emergency that happens. The first place people should look to is their church. And unfortunately, our church at the time was not up to the task. We got texted by our pastor, and he said, hey, they're going to cancel services because the air conditioner won't work. We don't have lights and the air conditioner doesn't work. And it's hot out, so we're going to not have services this Sunday. And I thought, wait a minute, how terrible is that? We're not going to worship God together because we don't have air conditioning? I go to countries all over the globe, and I often try to visit the churches wherever I go. And many of the places I go meet every Sunday without air conditioning. And so the fact that we would cancel our church services because of a lack of power was abhorrent to me. It was terrible. So once that crisis had passed, I got together and I asked for a few moments to speak to our church. And I got up at the pulpit and I said, we got a problem, people, because we just went through 2 weeks of people in their greatest moments of need, all the people that we purport to be serving here as a church. And they could not look to us for help because we couldn't even help ourselves, much less anybody else. And so I'm calling on our church right now to establish a crisis committee to make sure that this never happens again. That the next time that there's a large power outage or a flood or a fire or whatever happens, people should be able to come to our church and get fed and get water and get medical care and get hope because the church has prepared ahead of time to be able to help them. You know that there will be situations, and I've seen so many of them because I've covered lots of hurricanes and things like that. I could name a dozen hurricanes off the top of my head that have happened in the United States where FEMA was not up to the task. But in every case, all those areas, there were churches who came together, and the members of those churches went into the disaster area and helped the people who needed it. That's why these sort of parallel institutions to government are so important, because they are what God intended for people to look to in times of trouble. When things go bad, believers should be the ones who are not afraid to get in there and get their hands dirty and help the people who need it, even if that means doing it out of our own pockets. And Americans are known around the world for doing that in times of trouble. When there's a localized disaster in the United States, there are always people who come in from outside of the disaster area to volunteer their time to help. The thing that concerns me is that we may very well be confronted in the near future by not a localized disaster, but by a generalized disaster. That is the entire country, so that everybody will need to be trying to help the people around them. And as I have watched over the last 20 years, the amount of charitable giving go down in the United States, what that tells me is that there are fewer and fewer people who either have the wherewithal or the inclination to actually help their neighbor in a time of need. More and more people will be on the side of the ledger that represents liabilities than the side that represents assets in a time like that. Because there are fewer people who know how to put up things for a disaster. There are fewer people who know how to tend a garden or how to slaughter a hog. There are fewer people who know how to defend themselves and protect themselves. The sad part is there's a whole lot more guns in our society, but a whole lot less training of how to use a gun. So the number of guns to trained people is diverging. That's a problem. So getting training is very important. This is going to be a series of lives, not just one live, because there's far too much to go through. As I've been making notes, I ended up with the notes for this live ended up being more than 10,000 words. That's a book. And so I'm going to release my notes for paying supporters on Locals after this is over. And we're not even going to get through the first chapter. Now, we've talked about the complacency. We've talked about normalcy bias and all that. Now let's talk about how you start to figure out what to do to prepare. There's a term for this that the United States military uses when they go into a place. Let's talk about what the military calls human terrain mapping. During the war, when I was in Afghanistan, in Iraq, covering the war, if the US military went into a new part of Afghanistan, for example, and they decided they were going to set up a forward operating base there, that FOB, as it was getting set up, the US military would do something that it called human terrain mapping. Human terrain mapping means looking at the area around where you're located and figuring out what the people around you present to you in terms of resources, threats, and assets. So let's say one time the special forces went into a place called Chamkhani, which is out by the border of Pakistan, and I went with them. And the first thing they did when they set up their base, it was a very small base, small number of people. They're very vulnerable out there when they do that, when they first establish a new base, because the Taliban could come in with a large number of people and could absolutely surround you. And they had that happen more than once. So the first thing they did when they moved into that community of Chamkhani was they created a very high resolution map of the village. And they posted that map up on a wall in the Tactical Operations Center on the base. And they started sending out foot patrols into the village. And the job of the foot patrols they would give each foot patrol a section of the village and say, okay, these 4 houses are your job for today. I want you to go out. I want you to knock on the doors of those houses and those compounds. I want you to take the translators and I want you to talk to the people that live there, find out what their name is, find out what they do for a living. Gauge their friendliness towards you. If they seem very reserved and they don't want to talk to you, make a note of that. If they're very friendly, very forthcoming, if they invite you in for tea, make a note of that. Try to figure out, ask them about the village. What do they know about this village? How long have they been there? Again, what do they do for a living? Are they a farmer? Are they a plumber? Are they a mechanic? Those are good things to know. And who are they related to in the village? Ask them if they can tell you who the chief of the village is. And what do they think about that guy? Et cetera, et cetera. So they just interview the people that you go talk to. So I went with them. I was there as a journalist, but I went along with them on these patrols. And they would walk out of the gate, walk down the road, go up to a house, knock on the door, talk to the people inside, make notes of everything they learned. And then they would come back and then they would say, okay, this house was green, meaning friendly. They were nice to us. This house was red. They were not nice to us. They were not friendly. We got a weird feeling talking to those people. This house is yellow because nobody answered the door. It might be abandoned, or maybe they just didn't want to talk to us. And so we need to do some more research on that. And they went through this process of going through the whole village, just in concentric circles around the base, and establishing who lived where, what they did for a living, and what they brought to the table in terms of abilities. Can that guy fix things? Can that guy get us vegetables? Does that guy look like he's a militant? Et cetera, et cetera. And they made very good notes on all this stuff. That's called human terrain mapping. Now, that's where you start. And the reason that I wanted to start there with this live is because the first thing you need to do is figure out what you're looking at in your immediate area. So if you live in small town of Western New York, for example, like my friend Chris does, okay, so that's fine. Do you know your neighbors? Most people in America don't know their neighbors these days. This would be a good time for you to start to get to know them. And at least get to know them, even if you don't talk to them, by observing them. Well, they drive a $100,000 car. So does that mean they're a drug runner or they're a money manager in the city? How can I ascertain that? I can look at their house. I can look at the kind of people that come and go from their house. And I can start making just determinations as best I can about the disposition of my neighborhood and my neighbors. I would also add to that I would start taking regular walks around my neighborhood, and I'd start waving at people and let them know I'm a friendly guy. I want people to think that I'm friendly. I want people to know that I'm not a threat and I'm just a normal guy. So I'd be walking around my neighborhood and I'd be waving at people, but I would also be making notes like, hey, there's a pass-through between these two houses I didn't notice before that goes over to the next street. And the school kids use it when they're on their way to school as a shortcut. Right across from me where I'm standing, there's an empty building. If I lived in this building, I'd want to know what's going on in that building. Who owns that building? Why is it empty? Is it being used by squatters or whatever? Is the electricity on in that building? Is the water on in that building? Is the natural gas onto that building? I'd be asking a lot of questions and just trying to get a much better sense of what's happening in the neighborhood around me. And then I would expand that to the neighborhoods around my neighborhood and say, well, I live in a pretty good neighborhood, but I just noticed that there's a bunch of housing projects that butt up against the edge of my neighborhood. Well, not that there's anything wrong with the people there. Everybody's got to live somewhere, but it's more likely that people that live in a housing project in subsidized housing are not going to be as well prepared in terms of supplies and things like that. And so it would be a good thing to know that people from over there might come into my neighborhood looking for help. And that doesn't mean that I necessarily need to be investing in barbed wire. It might mean that I need to be investing in more supplies to help those people. Because look, if you think that you're going to go it alone, I always laugh when I hear people go like, oh, I got some woods near my house. Well, if the zombie apocalypse happens, I'll just go out there and survive, live off the land. No, you won't. You'll be the first person to die. You're not going to go live off the land. Look, military survival instructors would have a hard time living off the land long term, okay? It's a lot harder than you think it is. So don't think you're going to go hunting for deer when there's nothing in the grocery store. Well, you and 300 million other people are going to try to do that, and the deer are going to last about a week, and there will be no deer left. There will be no squirrels left. There will be no raccoons left, no turtles left, no snakes left, no anything left, because everybody like you thinks like you, and they're going to be out there, and you know what they're going to be shooting at? Each other. So that's not a good plan. And if you think, well, I'm just going to lock my doors and just pull the shades and I'm going to ride it out. Okay, maybe, but it might be a good idea to think about the fact that there's a whole neighborhood of people right over there who are going to be getting hungry before you do. And they're going to think, man, the people in that neighborhood probably have more money than I do. That means they probably have more food. And my kids are hungry right now. So they're going to be looking at the ski mask and looking at the gun and thinking about you. So it might be a good idea to address those issues beforehand and not wait until those people are banging on your door. And that comes down to community, and I'll get into that later. So this is all under the auspices of human terrain mapping. Just trying to figure out what the threats are, what the resources are. Like, oh, there's a lake over there where I could go to get water. But if I were going to have to do that, how would I transport the water to my house in sufficient quantity that I wouldn't have to make the trip 15 times a day, because that's risky? And how would I purify that water and ensure that it's clean when there are likely going to be people bathing in it, defecating in it, and things like that? Or part of my human terrain mapping might be like, oh, hey, my neighbor that I'm good friends with, he's got a swimming pool. But does he have a way to, so that's a nice source of water, but does he have a way to purify that water? And maybe I could help him with that, okay? These are all parts of human terrain mapping. Are there aging people that live in my neighborhood who might need help? And you might say, well, look, I'm going to be looking out for myself. I'm not going to be going around the neighborhood looking for senior citizens to give my food to. Well, oh, really? Might be a good idea to think about that, because those senior citizens likely have a lot more money than you do, because they might not look like it, but you might be surprised. They might have a lot of stuff that you can use. And oh, by the way, if they're still lucid, they probably remember a time when the resources weren't as plentiful as they are now. And they know lots of secrets of ways that could help you survive. So it might be a good idea to identify where those senior citizens live and perhaps get to know them now rather than later. And yes, you should be willing to go and rescue those people and help them in a time of need. So human terrain mapping is looking at community demographics, inventorying of skills and resources that are in your neighborhood. What are the leadership structures, both formal and informal, in your town, in your community, in your neighborhood, okay? And who in my neighborhood could be a potential ally or a potential threat? These are the kinds of things you need to think of beforehand, and I would suggest that you actually go through the process of either buying, printing, or drawing a map of your neighborhood and literally start marking houses. Is this house, who lives here? And then maybe keeping a spreadsheet. Maybe number all the houses in your town and make a spreadsheet and say, building number 1 is this. Here's what it is. Here's who lives there. Is it a 1 through 5 in terms of threats? If all of this sounds a little anal, okay. The more prepared you are before the loss of civility, the more likely you are to survive a loss of civility. And so I'm advocating for this because I do this. Call me crazy, but I have seen it in action in non-permissive environments around the globe, and it has saved a lot of lives. So you may just think, well, in America, we don't have to do things like this because we don't. Well, the time is coming when you might, so it might be a good idea to think about these things and at least maybe make a start. Just look, do this to whatever extent you think it is relevant to your situation, okay? In places that I have traveled, in Syria, for example, Syria, the whole government collapsed. And it was essentially a failed state in many parts of that country. And so there wasn't any law enforcement. And what people did is they got together and they formed neighborhood councils. And those neighborhood councils functioned like a homeowners association without the Karens. It was really more like a neighborhood watch, but it was armed. And those councils decided, okay, how do we lock down our neighborhood and make it safe? Where do we need to put blocking positions, for example? Should we have patrols at night, et cetera, et cetera? And they actually created little bubbles of civilization in a very uncivilized place. And so it's a good idea to follow their lead. The United States isn't Syria, but there are parts of the United States that are probably more dangerous, okay? So we've talked about how to start mapping the human terrain. Just start with the houses around you and then work your way out from there. Go for walks, get to know people, ask questions, and keep notes. See, we have seen in the United States the erosion of community bonds to the extent that all of us are more at risk because people don't work together anymore. They order their stuff off Amazon, and bartering with your neighbors is, for the most part, a thing of the past in most of America. If you live in one of those places in America where it's not a thing of the past, congratulations. And you should be very grateful. But you want to take steps to make sure your neighborhood does not become one of those places where it is a thing of the past. Now, let's talk about doing the same thing for your home. Once you have mapped out the human terrain around your house, now you need to start thinking about mapping the terrain in your home, doing the exact same thing on a micro scale. What is your home made of? Would it be easy for a mob of angry Antifa jackwagons to just come by and throw Molotov cocktails at your house and burn you out? Because I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in the United States. So if that is the case, do you live on a street? Would it be easy? Do you have ground floor windows? Think a mob of angry Antifa idiots rampaging down your street. How would that work out for you? Could they break your windows and throw Molotov cocktails in? There are ways to avoid that. And we can talk about the nitty-gritty of that, but suffice it to say, all I'm doing on this live is I'm going to kind of give you an overview. So kind of talk about how you ought to be thinking about these things. What kind of resources do you have in your home? This is not just about stocking up, but it's also about, what do I have? Do I have any land? Do I have any fruit trees? Do I have any firewood? Do I have anything to burn firewood with? I have a home out in the country in West Virginia, but we rented out as an Airbnb. And when we lived there, we had an outdoor wood furnace. And that's what we used to heat the house. And it was great. My boys and I would go out and cut 6 to 8 cords of firewood a year, stack them up in the woodshed. And we just had to go out there and feed that beast every few hours and then bank it up for the night. And we had a nice, toasty, warm house all winter long. It was great. But we had enough resources to go get the firewood on my property. And we had a place to put the firewood. And we had people to split the firewood. And that's pretty resource intensive. Now that house is being used as an Airbnb. We don't heat it with wood anymore. We heat it with electricity. And it's super expensive, $750 a month in the wintertime to heat my house. But that is also the place where my entire family will probably congregate if things go sideways. And so whenever I'm home, I'm always thinking about things like this, like, oh gosh, well, we'll probably bring a lot of the resources we need if we have to come there and congregate, but I need the infrastructure in place to be able to heat the home with wood again if that becomes necessary. So what would that look like? I can't just reinstall the drop of a hat an outdoor wood furnace, and I don't want to just put one in now and leave it sitting out there. So what I did was I actually found a guy who makes these very small, basically like camping wood stoves that will heat a room. And we still have the chimneys and everything in place in the house, where at one time they had wood stoves in the house. So I got the stuff at least built into the house that needs to be built in so that I can install one of these small wood stoves if necessary. We also installed an insert in the fireplace, a wood burning insert, that would allow us to use the fireplace as a heater, because the fireplace is pretty big and it wouldn't be a very efficient heater otherwise. And that's something that our guests who are renting the house can use as well. So it does double duty. Things like that. I'm assessing the resources that I have in place at my house and doing a terrain map of my house. What are the security vulnerabilities in your house? How energy independent is your house? There are lots of lost skills that I might not have that I might need in the case of a long-term grid down event or loss of civility. And so what I've done is compiled a library of how-to books on how to do that stuff. Now, learning how to build things or how to do surgery on the fly is not a good way to do it. But at least we have the resources in the house available to us so that we can get up to speed on some of the lesser used skills that we don't keep up with all the time, if necessary. So buying literature and equipment that would make me more survivable in my home, in my opinion, is a good investment. So there are some of your action steps. Now, I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about what I'm going to call health terrain mapping, just because it fits with human terrain mapping and home terrain mapping. Look, in the case of the world going sideways, you could never be in good enough shape. For many of us, that's the one thing that is going to lead to you not being survivable in a crisis. It's that you don't take care of your health. I realize everybody's busy, we've got work to do. You only get one of these, okay? And you will prioritize the things that are important to you. So when I see somebody who is morbidly obese and they don't have a medical condition that makes it impossible for them to take action on that, what I see is somebody who is not making it a priority. And I'm not trying to be callous, I'm not trying to be mean, but you only get one of these bodies. And if you are tremendously out of shape and you've let yourself go, congratulations, so have most of us. But it is an act of love to the people who love you for you to prioritize your health. We have more resources available to us today than ever before in human history on how to stay healthy, how to get healthy. And you don't even have to pay for most of it. YouTube is a wealth of resources on how to get and stay healthy. There are thousands of books on the subject from highly respected scientists and health professionals. All of that to say you don't have an excuse not to prioritize your health. And if you're not prioritizing your health, then the rest of it probably doesn't matter a whole lot because you're not going to survive long enough to enjoy it. You are going to be a liability and not an asset to your family. And so I would recommend not only looking at physical fitness as a survival tool and prioritizing it, but I would recommend thinking about your health in terms of what would I do if I couldn't just go get this stuff fixed at the hospital? I mean, your dental health, for example. What would you do if there wasn't a dentist on call, if you all of a sudden got a cavity or had broke a tooth because you're eating meat that somebody shot? If something like that happens to you and you, for whatever reason, cannot go to a facility and get high quality health care, how do you take care of that? Do you have some tools on hand to be able to clean your own teeth? Do you have a book that will show you how to pull a tooth if necessary? There are YouTube videos out there on that subject, by the way. So again, no excuse. I'm trying to change the way that I think about my own health as I get older to see, number one, my diet and my exercise as an act of love for my spouse and my children and my grandchildren. Keeping myself physically fit is an act of worship to God. It's saying to God that I value this incredibly complex machine that you've given me with which to serve you in the short time that I have here on earth. And I'm going to do the best I can to show you, God, that I'm grateful to you by taking care of this body that you've given me, taking care of my eye health, having a whole bunch of these around because you know how fast these get lost and broken. So I'm stocking up on on my reading glasses, trying to build and maintain my own relationships in my family, my extended family. Look, if there's a problem between you and somebody in your family, you might very well need them. Think about that. If the whole world falls apart tomorrow, am I going to have to go hat in hand to my brother, whom I haven't spoken with in 3 years, because we had a falling out over something stupid one time? And if that's the case, if there's somebody in my family like that, I should probably go ahead and try to reconcile that relationship now and not wait until the bad times come, okay? So, look, folks, I think that this is urgent. I think that in a matter of less than 60 days, you're going to need to be more prepared for mayhem and a loss of civility and possibly a breakdown in the logistics supply chain than you are now. And so I want to encourage you to think very hard about how you can get yourself more prepared in the weeks to come before the election. Now, I think we should have more talks about this. You tell me what you think. Do you believe that we should be talking more about this? And if you'd like to see more lives like this happen, say so in the comments. Let me know, and we'll do more of these, and we'll get deeper into these subjects and have actual conversations about these. Those of you who are supporters, I will put the notes from my talk up on Locals as a PDF. If you want me to, I can send you an EPUB so you could import it into Kindle and watch and read it there. But I'll put the PDF at least up on Locals as a supporter-only asset as soon as this is over, okay? So that's all I've got for now. Please let me know. Send me an email. Let me know what you thought of this. Send me your comments. I want to compile ideas and wisdom from all of you on this subject. What are you doing to prepare? What threats do you see out there that I haven't mentioned? And let's compile a knowledge base here at chuckholton.com where we can share and we can help each other be more prepared. Okay? All right. Thank you very much for watching. God bless you. Chuck Holton signing off. We'll see you later.